Welcome, everyone, to our first lecture of 2021, Contemporary French and American Jewish Life, the End of the Liberal Narrative, with journalist Marc Weitzmann. We are thrilled that so many could join us this morning from our home base in the DC metro area to homes across the country and beyond, Madrid and Israel, we know, and probably other countries besides. I am Rabbi George Driesen, a member of the board of directors of Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies, and I am honored to introduce this program. For those who are new to a Haberman Institute event, or who may not be acquainted with us, the mission of our organization is to provide high quality, in-depth encounters with Jewish thought, history, and culture, as I know we will have this morning. We have a wide array of lectures and classes coming up this year. Please visit our website, habermaninstitute.org, to explore our offerings and keep an eye on your email for weekly program reminders. On to today's program. Marc Weitzmann is an award-winning journalist who has published 12 books, including most recently, Hate, the Rising Tide of Anti-Semitism in France and What It Means for Us. He was chief editor of the literary section of Les Incorruptibles magazine. Did I get it right?
Yeah, you did.
Good.
Which is
In France for 10 years, and is a regular contributor to Le Monde, Liberation, and Tablet magazine. We are delighted to welcome Mr. Weitzmann from Paris this morning. After his talk, you will have an opportunity to ask your questions. Please share your questions in the Q&A box on your Zoom screen. Our staff will moderate the Q&A portion of this program. Barring any unforeseen technical glitches, we will share a recording of today's program with you later this week. And now, with that, welcome, Mr. Weitzmann, to the Zoom podium, and it is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to start the year with you. I don't see anyone right now on my screen, but I guess that's all right. So can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes. Good. Yeah. Okay. Because I'm not seeing anyone on the screen. So okay. So the subject of this talk is going to be the end of what Yuval Harari once called the liberal narrative that shaped the West, at least in the second half of the 20th century, and why and how the Jews play a part in it, and why it's important for the Jews that it ends now. My first my first intuition that that what we are calling the liberal narrative, which is pretty much equivalent to the liberal democracy, occurred in September 2000 as I was traveling in Israel, covering what the French press called the Second Intifada. One of the person I met at the time was Aaron Appelfeld, and I interviewed him for trying. I was trying to find an explanation to what was happening, and one of the things he said was this. I'm quoting him. He said, "The Israeli peace camp is moved by the old Jewish optimist faith in progress. It says, let us integrate the Arabs into the economic process and their attitude toward us will change." Of course, he added, it does not work. The Palestinians have no desire to be treated paternalistically or with condescension, and it's understandable. In the peace process, they see the sole product of imperialism, and in us, they see only Jews. The peace process he was referring to was, of course, the Oslo Accords. In 1990, the demise of the Soviet Union had made the PLO weak, with no more serious financial or logistical support to count on. And seizing this opportunity, international diplomats had undertaken to support the Israeli left's efforts to set up new rounds of talks with the Palestinians. Signed in 1993 in Oslo, under Bill Clinton's supervision, the treaty that resulted from those talks planned an exchange of land between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, the partition of Jerusalem, and the creation of a Palestinian state. Details were left to the negotiators. Long-term financial support to that new state was to be provided by new regional development based on new technologies. Those were the 90s. And what this meant was that the Palestinian state's economic and therefore political viability would depend upon the emergence in the coming decade of a Middle Eastern Silicon Valley between Cairo and Amman, with Palestine and Israel at its heart. This project would be Israeli engineered and financially and politically backed by an American power that was then at its peak. The new Palestinian middle class that would be born out of the success of this plan would set off a virtuous circle across the whole region, spreading democratic values everywhere. In other words, the peace process was part of the more general globalization that was characterized by Francis Fukuyama's End of History at the time. It basically stated that Dostoevskian revolutionary passion was a historical artifact. Who in his right mind would still want to riot, let alone blow himself up in blind terror attacks, if he had access to shopping malls, a decent job, a regular sex life, and a ballot to cast every now and then? Guided by global media and technologies, the sheep would lie down with the lion, in other words. So this is what ended in the 2000s. The question is why and how? It's only a year later, after the images of the World Trade Center crumbling to the ground, that we began to realize that what we had thought was the unavoidable tragedy of history was actually crashing down. So now we're living in a way in the consequences of that, not only of that crash, but also of the illusion of the 90s. And in a way, these illusions were the product of a global faith that the liberal credo had won against the totalitarianism of the second half of the 20th century. Liberalism was the winner, and Jewishness, in a way, had won as well. That's why the peace process was such a symbol for the new order. Yuri Sleskin, in his book, The Jewish Century, asks what made liberalism and Jewishness almost indistinguishable. George Steiner also said once that in essential ways, an Austro-Hungarian implosion with the 20th century was in essential way an Austro-Hungarian implosion in which the Jewish component was dominant. In other words, what we came to see as the Western dynamic, democracy and liberalism, is in a certain way tainted with Judaism, not with Judaism, but with a certain kind of Jewishness. Steiner, for instance, quotes a list of great going from Freud to John von Neumann and Robert Oppenheimer and Karl Popper, from Schoenberg to Irving Berlin, Aaron Copland, to which you can add anyone from Louis Mayer to Gregory Pincus, one of the inventors of the contraceptive pill, to Abby Hoffman, etc., etc. If you're French, the list includes the Front Popular leader Léon Blum, Pierre Mendès France, and the Jewish circle around Charles de Gaulle, who created the post-war idea of modern France. Jacques Derrida, François Truffaut, Jean-Pierre Melville, Simone Weil, who legalized abortion in France, not to mention virtually all Parisian intellectuals from the post-Sartre Camus generation on to today. So what I'm trying to say is that the 20th century, and certainly the second half of the 20th century, was framed by modernity in which the Jews played an essential part. The end, or at least the crisis of that modernity today, may well be also the end of a certain kind of Jewishness, what we call cosmopolitan Jewishness, or and which certainly flourished in the U.S. in an unprecedented way, but which was also very strong in France, even though in a less obvious way, which is what I'm going to try to show. Sletskin in his book translates the question into his own language, in which humanity finds itself metaphorically divided in two categories: what he calls the Apollyon peoples, pre-modern, sedentary, feudal, and identity-driven, and what he calls the Mercurian ones, the Mercurian people from the god Mercurio, the Greek Hermes, light-footed messenger of the change and divinity of commerce, crossroads, translations, and mutations. Uh, what Sleskin says is that although Mercurian people can be found everywhere, he lists a series of people from the Jews, the Gypsies, the Lebanese, the Farsis, the Jains, the Armenians. Only in the West did something like a Mercurian age emerge. This Mercurian age is more commonly called the modern age or the first modernity. It starts around the mid-16th century with the consequences of the great discoveries and of the religious wars in Europe. After the first confrontations with Native Americans and Africans forced questions about what human means, when science began to take off and the old cosmology of the Middle Ages cracked up. Of the four towering figures that shaped the age, the first modern age, artistically, one, the poet Luis Camões, author of the Lusíadas, was Portuguese, a term understood outside of Portugal at the time as meaning Jew. Because Portugal was swarming with Marranos or New Christians, the Jews forced to convert to Christianity and were said to more or less Judaize in secret. Two other main towering figures of that era were Miguel de Cervantes and Michel de Montaigne, who were the direct offspring of Marrano families. The fourth was, of course, William Shakespeare, who wasn't Jewish. He came from Catholic converts living in an Anglican England, haunted by the prospects of a foreign invasion and obsessed with split loyalties and dubious identities. What you really were and what you seemed to be at that age, at the age of that first modernity, was as much a Shakespearean theme, in other words, as it was a Marrano dilemma and a sign of the rising modernity. I am not what I am, as Iago puts it in Othello's first act, goes much deeper than a simple statement about hypocrisy. 3 centuries before Kafka and Joyce, the modern soul was shaped by men caught up in and faithful to antagonistic conjunctions and looking for a way out. The result was the discovery of the other within, as Yirmiyahu Yovel puts it, the invention of modern interiority, ambiguity, in which the Jews played a crucial part. The experience of the new Christians, the first modern Jews, prepared and anticipated the rise of the first libertin, a French word that became synonymous with dissolute aristocrats in the 18th century, but whose first meaning was skeptic, blasphemous, atheist. Mozart's Don Juan, an aristocrat of obscure origins, is all that in one, of course, all the more so perhaps for having been created by Lorenzo da Ponte, son of an Italian shoemaker and a Jew converted to Catholicism. Montaigne's non-judgmental mind, Cervantes' irony, Spinoza's pre-Freudian analysis of passions were only the cutting edge of a much bigger dynamic at play among European Jews in search of a neutral place, freed from religious passions, where tensions could be appeased. In which measure did Judaism, and not merely the converso phenomena, prepare the Jews to the disenchantment of the world that Max Weber studied from a Protestant angle? Religion as law aims at the subjugation of the merely animal instincts in man, at the bridling of his desires and inclinations, and at the replacing of impulses by thoughtful action. In short, at the ethical tempering of man. That's Sleskins who writes this. So is it surprising then if the French, who loved reason but since the religious wars lacked a significant Protestant community, turned to the Jews at the dawn of the Enlightenment? Moses formed and executed the astonishing enterprise of shaping into a national body a swarm of unhappy fugitives. This is Jean-Jacques Rousseau writing as far back as 1772. He dared to turn them into a free people, he says. French philosophers trying to define modern society as a collective enterprise undertaken by free citizens in order to defend their common interests looked up to the Jews. Soon, so did the politicians they inspired. In France, at the time of the Revolution, Jews did not exceed 40,000 people out of a total population of 23 million. Yet the National Assembly judged the question of their emancipation so crucial as to take up the question no fewer than 32 times between 1789 and 1791, the year emancipation was passed. In the eyes of the French, freeing the Jews from a legal status that forbid them to travel freely and submitted them to daily controls was not so much a duty dictated by humanistic concern as it was an organic necessity for the liberal dynamics of progress to take off. It was, in the words of David Nierenberg in his book Anti-Judaism, a subset and a surrogate for a much larger debate over how to achieve the conversion of millions of French subjects into citizens. This modelization of the Jews, so to speak, was so pervasive that at the end of the 19th century, still, the French historian Anatole Leroy-Beaulieu could write, "We have a name for the Jewish Messiah. We await him too. We call him as loudly as we can. It is called progress." By the time Leroy-Beaulieu wrote those lines at the last decade of the 19th century, the spirit of the Declaration of the Rights of Man had long since been spread all over Europe by the Napoleonic Wars. Reinforced by the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment set off by German Jews but influenced by French philosophers, it had brought with it the tidings of Jewish emancipation. The ghetto walls had tumbled down, along with the Russian Empire's Pale of Settlement, and the Jewish migration toward urban centers such as Warsaw, Vienna, Berlin, or Paris was in full swing. Sleskin writes, in Vienna, 62% of the lawyers, half the doctors and dentists, 45% of the medical faculty, and one-fourth of the total faculty were Jews, as were between 51 and 63% of professional journalists. By 1920, in Hungary, 59% of doctors, 50% of lawyers, 39% of all privately employed engineers and chemists, 34% of editors and journalists, and 28% of musicians identified themselves as Jews by religion. In Prussia, one-fourth of all lawyers were Jews. In interwar Poland, Jews were about 56% of all doctors in private practice, 43% of all private teachers and educators, and so forth and so forth. Further west, the liberalism these Jews championed was at its peak in Third Republic France, which, like the US, received a mass migration of Jews from Eastern Europe, fleeing both the pogroms and the decaying world of the shtetls that had started in the 1880s. In Paris, Jews were everywhere, in theater, in economy, and finance. So writes Dominique de Sainty, a French writer, in her biography of Marc Hanno, the populist, turbulent Jewish bisexual financier who founded her own bank in 1925 in Paris with her husband Lazare Bloch, and whose journal La Force was edited by my own grandfather. One of the most prestigious Parisian lycées, Janson de Sailly in the 16th arrondissement, was nicknamed the synagogue because of the percentage of Jewish students there, among whom was George Steiner. In the US, where a similar craving for education could be observed, Harvard's Jewish enrollment at the end of World War I was about 20%. Columbia's about 40%, and City College of New York and Hunter College were respectively 80% to 90% Jewish. And as the 20th century unfolded and Central and Eastern Europe crumbled under the totalitarianisms, it would fall upon the French and American Jews exiled to shape the heritage of this liberal trend in ways that were both complementary and opposing. I felt divorced from my own Americanness when I started out. This is a sentence from the great mid century American writer Saul Bellow, as he told me in an interview in Harvard in 1998. Through my family background, he told me, I was a color-filled mix of provincialism that wasn't really provincialism and of cosmopolitanism that wasn't really cosmopolitanism. And through my college education, I had acquired a classical culture and a classical language that, as pleasant as they were, did not reflect my own habits of speech, and in the eyes of the common man, passed as a pretentious, unjustifiable attitude. At the end of the 50s, that problem would become the material for one of Bellow's masterpieces, Herzog. But in 1948, when Bellow came to Paris on a Guggenheim grant, the book was not even in the charts. Bellow, whose Russian Jewish parents had moved from Montreal to Chicago in 1924 when he was 7, was at the time of his arrival to Paris a perfect example of that generation of American Jews raised by liberal emigres and in search of their identity that would help to define liberal America in the decades to come. He spoke Yiddish, Russian, English, Hebrew, and he had grown up in a polished Ukrainian neighborhood of a city ruled by Al Capone and Meyer Lansky. Bellow had known the Depression, had witnessed the political argument between his Menshevik parents and their communist friends, and in 1940 he had joined the Partisan Review, which was then in equal parts the intellectual headquarters of American Trotskyism, the best run way from which to launch a literary career in capitalist America, and with people like Philip Rav, Meyer Shapiro, Delmore Schwartz, and others, something of a sophisticated, snobbish shtetl. Bellow was trying to find a way to express and transcend this multiplicity, the chaotic richness in himself. He was trying to be an American, and it is telling that he had his breakthrough in Paris. He'd come to France out of a fascination for the previous generation of American expats, of course, but above all, for the country's alleged political and intellectual instruction and leadership, as he said. But post war France had nothing of the kind to offer at the time, at least not to someone like him. He told me I was depressed. Paris was depressed. The country had been humiliated once by the quick defeat in 1940, a second time by its own cynicism during the collaboration, and a third time for owing its liberation to foreign allies. As an American, I could feel the resentment, and as a Jew, I could perceive very directly traces of the attitude of the French toward the Jews during the war. He met with Sartre, with de Beauvoir, and the like, except Camus. It seemed he missed totally Camus, and he witnessed the hostile reactions of the intellectuals to the Marshall Plan. At Les Deux Magots and Le Floor and other trendy cafes of Paris's West Bank, anti-Americanism went along with sympathy for the USSR, something that, as the son of Russian emigre familiar with the realities of Stalinism, Bellow found both appalling and disconcerting. As an American, he analyzed it as a symptom of the same nihilism that had already destroyed most of Europe. The story is well known. One morning, he simply gave up the solemn European novel he had in mind and instead wrote the first sentence of what would become his first elegiac novel on America and a manifesto of sort for a generation of Jewish writers. It was the first sentence of The Adventures of Augie March, and it starts like that. I am an American, Chicago born, and I go at things as I have taught myself, freestyle. In his foreword to the Penguin edition of Herzog, Philip Roth remarks that Bellow's opening demonstrates the same sort of assertive gusto that the musical sons of immigrant Jews brought to America's radios, theaters, and concert halls by sticking their claim to America as subject, as inspiration, as audience. He quotes, quotes, among others, Irving Berlin's God Bless America, Oscar Hammerstein's Old Man River, Gershwin Bernstein's West Side Story, Copland's Ballads, Appalachian Spring, Rodeo, and Billy the Kid. All these composers who, just like Bellow, were looking for a distinctly American style that by fusing high and low languages would resonate with the new public that had grown up around the radio and phonograph, as Copland put it. Of course, in the US at the time, the quest to shape and voice an American culture was not limited to the Jews, nor to the left. Walt Whitman was the forerunner and source for them all, and John Ford, Duke Ellington, Bessie Smith, Billie Holiday, William Carlos Williams, and so many others were searching for it too. But the role these sons of immigrant Jews played in shaping the new American post-war culture was central. I don't think there's anything, for instance, like God Bless America in any other country. Um, what explains this particular symbiosis? Is it because in America, the Jews discovered with the Protestants a humorless, dignified way to be Jewish, as Leskin puts it? Or should we accept Harold Bloom's theory in The American Religion, according which the United States is less a Christian country than a Gnostic one, which finds in parts of Judaism some sort of metaphysical echo? In any case, despite xenophobic reactions, nothing stopped the Jews of America from becoming another tribe of the country. It was not so in Europe, particularly in France, where Jews had been exalted not as equals, but as a model. And yet, there too, Jews proved to be the key holders to modernity, albeit in a more discreet way. In French, if French Jews were never as assertive as their American counterparts, to use Roth's word, the discretion of their Jewishness verges on complete erasure in the public life of post-war France. The country had provided help to the Haganah in 1947. The exodus left for Haifa from the French port of Sète with the help of the government. But if helping the Jews abroad was okay, dealing with them inside of the country was a different matter. Guilt and shame over the country's collaboration with the Nazis was part of the problem, but so was the complexity of the Jewish situation itself. During the 20s and the 30s, the situation of the Jews in France was more or less similar to that of the Jews in the US, as we just saw. Whether they came from the recent Yiddish immigration from the East or from the more assimilated Jewish communities of Provence and Alsace, Jews in France had turned to entrepreneurship, theater, journalism, finance, or higher education. Like in the US as well, they were attracted to one form of or another of liberalism, often mixed with socialism. In the pre-war years, French Jews attained a prominence in national life that seemed impossible for their brethren in America for many decades after World War II. Led by Prime Minister Leon Blum, a secular Jew, the Popular Front that had reached power in 1936 counted 4 other Jewish ministers in its ranks, and it was met by a rabid anti-Semitism whose violence is unimaginable today. At the National Assembly, Blum was publicly insulted on a daily basis, called a thief, a female homosexual, and a delirious prostitute by militants of the L'Action Française, which was then the nationalistic movement and the most famous nationalistic movement of the country, and also a newspaper, very trendy newspaper. 2 of Blum's Jewish ministers, Marc Dormois and Jean Zay, lived under permanent death threats and would indeed be killed during the war by French pro-fascist activists. Nationalist militants regularly stood out in front of the Lycée Janson de Sailly chanting death to the Jews. As strange as it may seem, this anti-Semitism was nothing new in the country that had entered modernity by freeing the Jews. In fact, the history of French modernity had been shaped by anti-modern writers. The first of them, Joseph de Maistre, started like Edmund Burke's as a moderate until Robespierre's terror radicalized his position. His ultra-Catholicism, however, took him much further than Burke. A contemporary of the American and French revolutions, he was as anti-American and anti-Protestant as he was anti-Semitic. In the notion of progress and universalism, de Maistre saw no less than a satanic device brought up by a sect bent on overthrowing the natural order of things in Europe, aka the monarchies. De Maistre, who was Swiss but wrote marvelously in French, had a tremendous influence on nearly every corner of French cultural and political life. His counter narrative to the Enlightenment was the cornerstone of Balzac's and Flaubert's writings, and above all, of his most genial disciple, Baudelaire, who borrowed from him the dark irony, the sharp style, and the Gothic tastes that would come to define the distinctive meanness of French literature until Céline and Welbeck. Walter Benjamin was right when he pointed out in his book on Baudelaire the pre-fascist tendencies of the French of the French poet. Perhaps with the exception of Rimbaud, who significantly stopped writing at an early age and left the country altogether, France never had a Walt Whitman to chant both the horrors and the beauties of progress. The spontaneous me singing a simple, separate person, yet uttering the word democratic, as Whitman proclaimed himself, was unimaginable in a class of intellectuals whose watchword was decadence and who were obsessed with the nobility. This mindset was not without consequences in the way they saw the Jews, whom they associated with the new era of unbridled urbanism and money. A beautiful conspiracy to organize the extermination of the Jewish race, wrote Baudelaire, only half jokingly, in Mon cœur mis à nu, one of his last books. At the turn of the 20th century, during what was known as the Belle Époque in Paris, the heirs of this class defined themselves as a disgusted generation. Those are the words of Maurice Barrès, one of the main writers of the era. Uh, they thought they were living in a world in which one is bored, according to another writer of the day, Edouard Peyron, where progress for them was synonymous with corruption. Edouard Drumon's anti-Semitic firebrand, La France Juive, Jewish France, was an instant bestseller, prefiguring the Dreyfus case by 10 years. It was followed by the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, written at the Parisian Russian embassy by two agents of the Jar, but influenced by the city's atmosphere. Another trap awaited the Jews aside from the hatred of those who rejected modernity that they now symbolized, namely, the ambiguities of the emancipation process itself. In 1791, the National Assembly, in defining the country's new identity, had used the Jews from the past, the ancient Hebrew, as an abstract ideal for the French model of a universal nation, while the actual Jews living in the country were turned into guinea pigs for the new concept of nationalism. In exchange for emancipation, Jews were obliged to renounce the legal autonomy that had been theirs during the ancient regime. In other words, they had to abandon their particularism as a group in order to melt into the general will that, according to the newborn republic, was embodied by the state. To the Jews as individuals, everything; to the Jews as a nation, nothing. This famous sentence, the battle cry of the Jews' friends at the time of the revolution, perfectly captures the double edge of what would come to be known as French assimilation, which led in turn to the French invention of the Israelite, the Jew who bears no public Jewish distinctive traits and yet remains Jewish somehow, a kind of modern Marrano. Remarkably, this programmatic cultural erasure did not stop the Jews from putting their mark on French modernity. Hans Proust, arguably the most influential writer of the country in the 20th century, whose Jewishness was as elusive as his being gay, two conditions that can be seen to have been the two main generators of the entire fabric of urban modernity in the West, as George Steiner once remarked. And yet, what would In Search of Lost Time be without Proust's portraits of Jews and of homosexuals, probably the best ever written in French literature? In Black Skin, White Mask, Frantz Fanon studied the consequences of this assimilating process for Blacks, yet no serious work has been undertaken on the price paid by the Jews, perhaps because the Shoah presented itself as that price. Yet between 1880 and the 30s, as a non-assimilated Yiddish-speaking immigration from the East settled in the heart of Paris, the Plaza, today Le Marais, the assimilating model had already entered a crisis. It didn't take long for the Israelites to turn against the new immigrant Jews and blame them for the rising tide of anti-Semitism. In 1940, the Consistoire, which was the official religious structure of the French Jews, aligned itself with the anti-Semitic politics of the Vichy regime. Synagogues were divided between French and foreign Jews, who ended up being the first to be deported. In return, it was among these migrants, mostly secular Jews, that some of the first Jewish resistance networks were set up. Such complexity helps explain the embarrassment of the French toward the Jews after World War II. If the Jews did not conform to the assimilationist model any longer, who and what were they exactly, and what was France? At the dawn of the Cold War, two political narratives were doing their best to reshape the country's ego, along with its political legitimacy in the eyes of the world. One was the Gaullist, the other was the communist. Both came from the resistance, both were badly in need of an international acknowledgement, both emphasized the centrality of the state in uniting the country, and neither allowed for any recognition of the divisions verging on civil war that had damaged France, even less, of course, of the specific fate that had befallen the Jews under the Vichy regime. Don't look back. This was the unspoken motto, possibly too one of the main reasons for the rise of the French taste for abstraction and theories over facts. Where in the United States, Bellow, Mailers, Tyron, Capote, and others were paving the way for the exuberance that would characterize the American novel in the second half of the century and the Jewish exuberance that would characterize American public life. In France, Sartre's being and nothingness was the rage, and theoreticians of Le Nouveau Roman were about to proclaim the death of the narrative. Where in the United States, Irving Berlin's God Bless America sounded like a triumphant quasi national hymn sung at ball games, Le Chant des Partisans, the partisan song, written by two Jews, the novelist Joseph Kessel and Maurice Druon, was more of a dark underground sort of song. That the most popular among this generation of Jews remained secretive Marino-like figures in public life is telling. Druon would become famous in France in the 60s, but as the best-selling author of a saga on the Catholic kings of France, Les Rois Maudits, I'm not sure how to translate this in English, the cursed kings. And he was also the secretary of the Académie Française. Kessel was known as a writer of exotic Russian origin. Romain Gary, who published his first novel, The European Education, in 1945, played hide and seek with his Jewish identity until the end of his life. So there was never an affirmation of Jewish identity in France's in post-war France. Yet the Jewish influence was perceptible everywhere. Pierre Mendès France was a former minister of the Blum government who became prime minister in the 50s. A secular Jew from Bordeaux with Sephardic and Marino forebears from Portugal, and a personal fascination in someone who had a personal fascination for the history of the Marinos. Mendès France had joined de Gaulle in London as soon as he escaped the jail of the Vichy regime. In 1940, the first resistors around de Gaulle were mainly composed of patriot nationalists whose minds were shaped by l'Action Française and other xenophobic movements, and who saw parliamentarism, liberalism, the Republic, and the Jews as key factors for France's decadency and defeat. Along with the handful of Jews that surrounded him in London, Mendès helped reshape the Gaullist movement as a more democratic force. Amongst the Jews were George Boris, Jean-Luc Rémy-Briac, and others. In 1945, the Gaullists became the first right-wing party in France to submit to the République whore, as l'Action Française had called it before the war. And this submission was largely, at least in part, thanks to the Jews that surrounded de Gaulle. Mendès France's long-range influence on post-war French history can't be overestimated. He was the first public figure after the war to prioritize rationality, pragmatism, and economic science over the lyricism and heroic culture that plagued French political culture. This exasperated de Gaulle, who needed him nonetheless and used him as his key advisor. Mendès' cold analysis of the country's new situation, an empire that didn't have the means to keep its colonies, made him a partisan of Indochina's independence and a target for both the nationalist right and the communists, who all saw him as an unpatriotic Jew willing to sacrifice the country's interest for money. Jews did not invent the modern liberal welfare state that would change the common man of the Depression and war years into the middle class, but they were central in popularizing and institutionalizing it. Mendès shared with his American counterparts an attraction toward the theories of John Keynes, whom Felix Frankfurter had introduced to Roosevelt in 1934 and whom Mendes had met and befriended at Bretton Woods 10 years later. Mendes advocated for ethics in politics and in economy, investments in scientific research and new technologies. During his brief time as President du Conseil, then the equivalent of prime minister between 54 and 55, Mendes found his main support in the newly founded L'Express, a news magazine with intellectual prestige that was created to support him. Francois Mauriac and Camus were regular contributors, and the magazine's editorial team was overwhelmingly Jewish. When Jean Daniel, a Jew from Algiers and a friend of Camus, left L'Express to create the Nouvel Observateur in the early 60s, both magazines became central in setting the tone of intellectual life in France. By the next decade, Le Nouvel Obs, as we call it here, would report on the creation of Doctor Without Borders by Bernard Kouchner and Ronnie Broman, two Jews, and become the base of French intellectuals such as André Glucksmann, Alain Finkielkraut, and Bernard-Henri Lévy, who voiced their support for the same dissident Eastern European writers who were supported in the US by Bellow Roth and others. Is it too much to say that Paris and New York were then the center of the West? When and how it ended can only be suggested here. The Six-Day War surely was a wake-up call for the Jews on both sides of the Atlantic, all the more so perhaps in France, where the desire to forget the occupation years had been eased by the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. The logic was, if the problem was solved there, you don't really need to be Jewish here. My uncle certainly thought that way. Not only did the Six-Day War show that the problem was not solved after all, it also brought up the specter of a reversal of alliances. Where France had supported Israel in 48 and 56, it now looked for a way to palliate its vanished empire by finding new partners in the Arab world. There is the long-term effects of the Yom Kippur War in 1973, with its ensuing oil crisis that broke rational, reasonable Keynesianism or revealed its fundamental flaws, depending on the viewpoint. By the end of the decade, Reaganomics, the Iranian Revolution, the Chinese economic reforms, and the Afghan War were paving the way for the 21st century. As a model for society, the middle class was already gone. Yet France stuck to its traditions. An aging Mendes France devoting his retirement to the dream of peace in the Middle East was there when François Mitterrand became the first French socialist president since Blum in May 1981. After Mendes's death, 1 year later, it would fall on Robert Badinter, the offspring of a Jewish family of Bessarabia and Mitterrand's Minister of Justice, to embody the ethical dream of the liberal French tradition. Later on, he would be joined in the popular nostalgia for the decades of prosperity by Simone Weil, the Auschwitz survivor who passed a law on abortion rights in the 70s. But something was different now. In a few decades, power had transformed the French intellectual class into something that had come to be known as la gauche caviar, a category that would soon translate in the US on the ruins of the middle class as limousine liberalism. Dominique Strauss-Kahn could name Mendes France as his favorite economist at the conference on Keynes at the Brookings Institute in 2011, just a few months before his arrest for sexual assault at the New York Sofitel, something that would have never happened to someone like Mendes, for instance. In retrospect, the bicentennial of the revolution in 1989, the very year of the fall of the Berlin Wall, was the swan song of French universalism. The end of the Cold War played a similar role in the US. It only took 10 years to recon, in a way. The tragedy of American politics at the turn of the 21st century, after September 11, was a misplaced nostalgia for a time when the self-image of the country coincided with the image the rest of the world had of it, namely the vital liberal America of the post-World War II era. If reason and pragmatism worked then, why would not it work now? But nostalgia could only obscure the outlines of the new age we've entered. I don't know if there's someone else. Did you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, it
It's
was,
a bit
it's
weird
great.
to it's a bit weird to speak on in front of that screen without seeing anyone, but if you heard me, that's fine.
Yeah, we heard and saw you, yeah, the entire time. Thank you. Yeah, the webinar feature's a little different sometimes, but everybody out there could see and hear you and hear me now. And we have a few questions, and if anybody else wants to add some questions, please do so now. You can click on the little Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom window, and we'll be able to ask your question. So there's the first question here is about contemporary society. Is the French upper class anti-Semitic today?
Um, I don't think the upper class is anti-Semitic today. There's a lot of anti-Semitism in France today, but it doesn't necessarily come from the upper class. It rather comes from down to the top. That's the big difference between now and the 30s, if you will. In the 30s, the elite was anti-Semitic. Uh, 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 the anti-Semitism existed at the time in the popular classes, but it was not as spread as it is today. Today you have, of course, we all know about the problem in the cities and sections of the Muslim youth, but the yellow vest is not. Uh, 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 I mean, anti-Semitism is referring to the yellow vests either, for instance, if you're familiar with the terms. Um, so we're dealing largely because of social network. We're dealing with a complete different situation than was the case in the 30s at the time of in a time when ideologies were dominant. We don't have ideology today to frame really anti-Semitism except Islamism, but the feeling is here. So it's it's an I don't know how to put it exactly, but it's a feeling without a shape, without a clear narrative. It just pops up, on social media every other day. Uh, every occasion is good for it. But as for the elite, I wouldn't say that there is rabid anti-Semitism today among French elite. No.
Thank you. There's a few questions as you've laid out what has happened in the past. There's a few questions about what you see, like where do we go from here, and what do you have any thoughts on what will happen in the 21st century as
Yeah.
we
Well, I was trying here to summarize as best as I could what seems to me the main currents of the liberal order, during which the middle class was the model and some a sort of ideal for life in democracy. And it seems to me that the Jews played a central part in shaping this ideal, including in culture, including in the critic of the West. The Jews were the dynamic force, if you will, in both shaping the liberal trend and criticizing it, as they always do. But the, now that the model is fractured, if not totally crashed, uh, we don't really know what the future has in store. We can only see what's going on. We can only testify one year after another. It seems clear that we're facing a kind of global rise of populism, of which uh, we in France, for instance, experienced a terror wave of unprecedented scale in 2015, 2016. It was preceded by the killing of Jews in 2012, of Jewish children in 2012 in Toulouse, and before that, by a rise of anti-Semitic incidents of violent nature. So in France, this populism is connected first with Islamism, but I see Islamism only as the Muslim version of a populist wave that transcends culture and countries. You have it in the U.S. as well in different form, but the connections between the two is striking. If you put together what the Islamist propaganda is saying, what the yellow vests are saying, what the Trumpists in the U.S. are saying, you begin to see a kind of connection. You begin to see a kind of common narrative, unshaped narrative, in which anti-Semitism plays a kind of uh, uh, plays the part of it coalesces different elements that otherwise don't make sense, if you will. In France, the anti-Semitism was the driving force of the violence that the Islamists used to build up to spread their narrative. But the anti-Semitism pre-existed to the narrative of the Islamists, if you will. The Islamists gave a sort of a pseudo-rational form to the anti-Semitic energy and used it for violence. In the U.S., it's different, but when you see the images of the Capitol, for instance, you see these guys with the T-shirts on Auschwitz, for instance. You see that in both cases, uh, the anti-Semitism is used as a kind of fuel to energize people, even when Jews are not even, I mean, in really in the picture. There's no real connection between the riots at the Capitol and the Jews. It doesn't make any sense. But it's there. It's there as an impulse, as the energy and the necessary energy to go further. I don't know if I'm clear.
Yeah, yeah, and I have a few follow-up questions here about anti-Semitism in France, and just you know, is it, in American media or whatever, you see different things, and so the question is France really so dangerous for Jews today, or is it just like an impression? And like, just in general, what is life like for Jews in France in light of
Yeah, there's a paradox with terror. Even in dangerous period, even during the terror wave of 2015 and 2016, during which 236 people died of terror action, the percentage of being the victim of a terror attack was very low, even for the Jews. Apart from these attacks, you have also random attacks against Jews in the streets, for instance. That happens. Is it dangerous? Well, the answer is yes and no. There is no Kristallnacht in France today. There hasn't been in the last 20 years. There hasn't been anything like it. But you do have in the neighborhood where I live, for instance, you have to pay attention. You have to be careful. I wouldn't take the subway, for instance, with a yarmulke today on my head. I'm not religious, so I wouldn't do it anyway. But if I were, I would pay attention. I would be careful. I'm even careful of the books I'm taking with me to read, just in case, because things happen. They don't happen on a daily. They don't happen daily. You don't have to carry a gun when you go to the supermarket, but things may happen. So what I'm saying is that there's a tension that's perceptible.
Yeah,
And if you live in some neighborhood, during the 2000s, certainly in some neighborhood, Jews had to simply to leave. The children were put in private schools, even when parents were secular, because of what was happening in the public schools that they were in. And basically what the Jews did were to regroup. They didn't leave the country, but they moved from some suburbs to some other places, and they regrouped in some cities and in some neighborhood to be between them, because they didn't have any choice. So it was bad. It was bad, and it is bad in that sense. In some places, you really have people are being threatened, and you have to be careful.
So in that sense, do you see what do you see as the future for Jews in France?
The question is, what do you see as a future for anyone? Because I mean, really, the Jews are the forefront of what happens to everyone else. The terrorist wave of the 2015, 2016 hit everybody. The Bataclan Theater, the attack of the Bataclan Theater, for instance, made more than 100 victims. It wasn't especially directed against the Jews, even though the place was picked up because the theater had been owned by two Jewish brothers for decades. So the terror wave hit everyone, but it started with random acts of brutality against the Jews in the early 2000s. So what I'm trying to say is that the main question is, Jews are the main question is what will happen to us in general, the Jews being at the vanguard of the bad news in general. It's anti-Semitism is the energy with which violent groups are legitimized themselves to kill anyone else. Once you've begun to kill the Jews, then you can kill anyone else. That's all right, So what will happen to French Jews specifically? I don't know, and I'm not very optimistic. But I'm not. The reason I structured my talk like that is that I'm not for years, if not for decades, America was for me, and not just for me, for a lot of French Jews, a kind of counter place, a place where to go if things went really bad here. There was always the U.S. to come to and take shelter. This is gone. This is not this is not true any longer. This was 20th century America. This is not 21st century America. We don't know what's going to happen to the Jews in the US either. Now, I'm not saying that there's going to be pogroms tomorrow in the US. I don't believe that at all. But the symbiosis I'm talking about in this talk, I don't see it today any longer in the US. I see traces of it, of course, big traces, places where it's still there. But as a dynamic, it seems to me to be gone. And that's sad. For people like me, it certainly is sad. I used to speak with Philip Roth a lot, and there was this notion that there was two Zionisms in the 20th century. There was the Zionism that created Israel, and if you take Zionism as the ideology of the normalization of the Jews, the real normalization of the Jews was the U.S. much more than Israel because of the tensions there. That doesn't happen in the U.S. This is not so true any longer. So in a way, we're all experiencing in the 21st century a kind of new exile.
So is for French Jews, is Israel still feel like an option, or is that the only option, or was that an option before?
It's always what we've seen during the tensions here. It's a theoretical option. Even at the worst time here during the last few years, some Jews did leave France to Israel for Israel, but not so many. There was never the wave of migration that Netanyahu wished there would be. It was more like some people did leave and went to Israel, but you have to remember that it's not the geography is not the same. When you leave the U.S. for Israel, it's kind of a no return. It's a very long trip. If you're going to Israel from Paris, it's a 5-hour trip. It's a 5 hours trip. So it's easy to come back. So what people do, in fact, Jews that are the means for it, may buy an apartment in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem or Haifa or elsewhere, but they don't necessarily go live there. They keep it as a residency for vacations or just in case you need to leave. But basically, they remained in France. And as for the people that did leave for good during the rise of anti-Semitism in this country, they rather went to Miami or LA. They didn't so much go to Israel. No.
Yeah, thank you. Another question here. You mentioned the global rise of populism. Do you see this as part of strengthening nationalism worldwide? Do you see differences in the current state of the Jews in France and the Jews in other parts of Western Europe?
I'm sorry, say again.
Oh, sorry. You mentioned the global rise of populism, and the
right.
question is, do you see this as part of a strengthening nationalism worldwide? And do you see differences in the current state of the Jews in France and the Jews in other parts of Western Europe?
Well, if I see this global populism as a strengthening of nationalisms, not exactly, because I think nationalism, as like most of the isms, belong to another century. It's a fake nationalism, and that's the problem. It's all the more violent because it's not really credible. You know, there was this documentary on Bannon. I don't know if you saw it a few 1 year ago, I think it was, when you saw Bannon in Venice setting up a meeting with nationalists leaders of Europe. And you saw the paradox of all those nationalist leaders gathering around Bannon because he was an American and trying to get some prestige from the American man in order to promote their own nationalistic ideology. And even between them, they were trying to find a common ground, a common internationalism of nationalisms, but it didn't really make sense. So somehow the violent impulse of the nationalism does exist and is on the rise, but it's not exactly. It's like, it sounds more like a mockery of nationalism than a real nationalism, like most of the things today, by the way. What was the other part of the question about the Jews? If
Was do you see differences in the current state of Jews in France with Jews in other parts of Western Europe?
No, I see well, in Western Europe, but France is the place where you have the biggest Jewish community in Europe, with 500,000 people, 500,000. There's no there isn't the equivalent anywhere in Europe today. So there's that. It's a very specific situation, and all the more so because we also have the biggest Muslim community in Europe. And it's also where the nationalist, the xenophobic tendencies and national populism first began. The Jean-Marie Le Pen came as in the first round of the presidential elections in 2002 as a general surprise, and for a moment, France became the point of focus of all the post-fascist movement of Europe. They flowed in Paris because of that in the early 2000s. So we have those various elements that are very unhealthy, that are kind of mixed in this country, and that explains the specific situation of the Jews to a point. You know, that's unique. You don't have that in Spain. You don't have that in Germany. You don't have, that's unique. And it probably partly, I mean, up to a point, it explains the rise of the other violence in the last 20 years.
And on that note, is there like who is perpetuating the anti-Semitic violence? Is there a specific place to point to? Populists, nationalists, Islamists, or people without?
The Islamists certainly do. There's no question. It's obvious. But they're not the only ones. The Islamists are the militants. So they have a speech. They have a topic, an anti-Jewish topic that takes the form of anti-Zionism, but is mostly is mostly anti-Semitic. But this topic is translated and inspired by a more popular form of anti-Semitism that is in the culture of the of some of the Muslim families. So that makes it more difficult to fight, because it's not just a political discourse; it's also prejudices, political cliches, and it's in the language, and it spreads very fast through the internet, of course, through the social networks. But it doesn't. It's not just that. It's you find anti-Semitism elsewhere in different sectors of the population. We have a famous comedian in France called Dieudonné Balambala, who's black, and he's half African and half French. And for decades in the 90s, in the 2000s, from the 2000s on, especially, Dieudonné held spreading anti-Semitism in his shows. He has acquaintances both with the Islamists and with the extreme right. So that's a bit complicated. It's not, because the extreme right is supposed to be racist and anti-Islam, but it does share a certain number of values with some of the Islamists. So it comes from all corners, and you have also some of the leftists that are also a problem. What you call in the U.S. the equivalent of what you call in the U.S. the Antifa are a problem in France as well. Basically, all those tendencies are regrouped under one category that you could call adepts of identity politics. People that takes identity above everything else. You know, whether it is nationalists or religious or whatever you like. It is the enemy. It is really the enemy of the Jews, because as I tried to point out in the talk, Jews, at least Jews in modernity, Jews in secular life, are preserved their identity as Jews through a number of mutation, through a capacity for metamorphosis. You can be different things, if you will, and still be Jewish. In a way, Jews are the very existence of the Jews is anti-identity. You cannot be when you're Jewish, you have to be Jewish and something else. Whatever you do, even religious Jews are like that. So for tenets of identity, people that place their identity above everything else, this is unbearable. They feel threatened. So, and you can find a lot of these people here in France today, but I think in the U.S. as well now. This is new. I mean, the U.S. was always the country of the mix. I mean, if there's a country who championed the capacity for change, always changing, it always was the U.S. And I think it's one of the keys, one of the reasons why Jews and American culture were so able to mingle. Now, it seems that the U.S. is looking for a kind of identity as well. So, and it's at least that's what Trumpists are looking for. You know, the key word is the search for authenticity. People are trying to be authentics. You know, authentic Muslims wanting to live like the Prophet, authentic French trying to live like the real French, authentic Americans trying to live like true Americans. That is to say, like and following Trump. So that's the enemy. That's what leads to anti-Semitism to me. You know,
is the government in France doing anything about the anti-Semitism?
Yeah, they're trying to do a lot, but but it's very difficult. One of the difficulties is that the more the government will do against anti-Semitism, the more it will bounce back on the Jews, because people will accuse the Jews to be too close to the government, as always, to manipulate the government for their own benefit. So in a sense, the more you fight, and the more a government fights anti-Semitism, the more it's a proof that the anti-Semitic discourse on the influence of the Jews is true. So it's kind of a perverse circle. It's very difficult to fight that.
Thank you. In American Jewish university, students have serious campus problems. This is a question I'm quoting here. Problems coming from pro-Palestinian students. Although French university life is different from the American model, do Jewish students have the same issues?
There's been a couple of examples, yes. Yeah, but it's not so. I don't think it's. I think it's worse in the U.S. on that regard. We did have a couple of examples of Jewish students that had problem with Palestinians, but it's not the main issue. The main issue is more like the equivalent of the woke in France. It takes the form of anti-Zionism and stuff like that.
Thank you. The Jews of Algeria during the French occupation were not allowed to get a job in the French government and could only work in wholesale or retail in the private sector and could not live in a French neighborhood. Do you have any comments on how the French exported their attitudes toward Jews in the colony?
Sorry. So you have to say that again.
Right. Okay. This is a question about the Jews in Algeria here, a different subject. So during the French occupation, they were not allowed to get a job in the French government and weren't allowed in a lot of aspects of life in Algeria. So do you have any comments on how the French exported their attitudes about Jews?
Well, it was pretty much the status of the Jews by the Vichy government was applied in the colonies as well. So Jews in Algeria were deprived of their nationality as well during the Vichy regime. There was no difference. There was no real difference in that regard. It may have been, I'm not sure, but it may have been a bit less difficult on a daily basis because there were Germans there, but it was not like in Paris, for instance, where the Germans were everywhere. But Vichy's policy was applied in the colonies as well.
Can multiculturalism exist in France, or must the immigrant assimilate to gain cultural and economic equality?
Well, I don't know how to answer that question because can you formulate it again? Because it seems to me that the question is a contradiction. It contains a contradiction. Can you say it again?
Sure. The question was, can multiculturalism exist in France, or must the immigrant assimilate to gain cultural and economic equality?
But is there I mean, do you have to choose? Can't you assimilate and be multiculturalist? Can't you be a society that assimilate everyone and be multicultural? I think both are possible. So I don't really know how to answer that.
Yeah. On a similar, I mean, I guess on a similar note, there's a question about the differences between visibly religious Jews by clothing and assimilationist Jews. Do you have any thoughts on the differences between the two?
Could you make a more specific question? Because the two exist, and the religious Jews today are more of Sephardic origins, mainly. Meaning they generally come from Arab countries, and from which they were they were expelled after the independences. So they're by tradition they're more religious than the Ashkenazi Jews who are more assimilated. Uh, I don't know what else to say because the question is not very precise.
Yeah, is there I guess the person who like added a little more here is are they accepted differently in liberal society as
Oh, um, they're they're generally by society at large. Yeah, both of them are accepted. Again, the anti-Semitism targets all the Jews. Whether, of course, it's more obvious if you're anti-Semitic and you want to hunt down Jews in the streets, it's easier to spot a religious Jew than a secular Jew like me, for instance, because you won't recognize it. So in that sense, yeah, there's a difference, but it's not society per se doesn't make any difference between the two. No.
scanning the questions here? Are there so like who are the Jews today that are most involved in this struggle in France?
You mean you want names?
Uh,
What do you
are,
mean? What's the question? What-
are there any yeah, sure, if there are there any names or any narratives that you find relevant or
no,
interesting to tell us?
I mean, you have organization, Jewish organizations that are fighting anti-Semitism today in France. Yeah, sure. Um, More or less well, more or less accurately, but it's going on. Yeah.
This is just a question about your project here, but somebody asked, and we can send out any materials to the participants, but about if you have any you packed much into your discussion, so if there's an article that we can pass along or other materials, there's interest in that from some of our participants.
Oh yeah, sure. I could send you some references of books, but maybe not here, not right now. Do you want them by? Do you want me to write them down and email them to you?
Yeah, you can email them to
Yeah. Okay,
email
I'll
me or
do that.
Becky,
Yeah.
and then we can forward it out to everyone who came today.
Sure. Sure.
Do you have any thoughts on your next project or relevant
Well,
project?
I may work on assimilation because it's an interesting subject. The assimilation and universalism is a complicated is a complex subject. So I may work on that. Mhm.
I think. Do you have any final thoughts that you want to leave us with, or anything that you're?
No, I don't know. I'm just well, I'm very grateful to be to for having been here, and I don't know. I'm trying to you know, in a sense, this talk was a kind of mourning talk about an era that I have nostalgia for. You know, where at least you had the feeling of that there was a center in the Western world, a center that could embody the ideals of democracy and liberalism, and where the Jews were at home. I don't think uh, Jews are at. I don't feel the Jews are at home anymore. Certainly not in Europe. Certainly not where I am, and maybe not. And let's say less in the U.S. It seems to me than they used to be. So so there's a new what I'm trying to say is that there's a new condition of exile to reflect upon in the 21st century. That's
Yeah.
that's all I can say.
Yeah, thank you, and I'm sure our all of our attendees appreciate your deep and thoughtful lecture and answering their questions. So I'm sure our participants have much to reflect upon and look forward to seeing some of your bibliography and some additional resources. And so, and I just want to thank you
Well,
all
thank
for
you.
joining us today. I know it's morning for many of you and an afternoon for others. So I hope you all have a great rest of your day. And I look forward to seeing you again at one of our upcoming programs. So you can check out the Haberman Institute website for more information. So have a great rest of your day, and thank you again.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.